I'm Roger Mudd. Welcome to the History Channel. Howard Hughes was famous for his eccentricities, his fear of germs, his vast fortunes, and his final years as a recluse. But Hughes was also a visionary who built TWA into one of the world's great airlines. The other great airline was Pan Am, created by the genius Juan Trippe. Hughes and Trippe, bitter rivals determined to put one another out of business, and competitors whose innovations transformed an industry. Back in the more elegant days of air travel, TWA and Pan Am were the giants, led by two giant personalities. Join us now as the History Channel presents Empires of Industry, Battle for the Skies.
Crowded airports, long lines, jammed seats, and lost luggage. From frequent flyer miles to the discomforts of coach class, there's little, if any, romance in modern air travel. But there was a time, a bygone age of barnstormers and daredevils, leather jackets and silk scarves, when an airplane flight seemed as wondrous and fanciful as a magic carpet ride. But early aviation was more than just a thrilling adventure. It was also a battleground. From the endless scramble for bigger, faster, more reliable planes to the relentless drive to carve a niche between the railroads and steamship lines, life for the pioneer airlines was a constant struggle. Only the strong survived. Two of the strongest dominated the battle for the skies. One, a visionary businessman who practically created the airline industry from scratch. The other, a maverick millionaire who bought his way to the top. Their epic struggle would change the airways forever and shape the way the entire world travels. Flight got off to a shaky start in 1903 with Orville and Wilbur Wright. Bicycle builders and backyard tinkerers, the Wrights' first flight, though monumental in its implications, was a mere 120 feet and lasted only 12 seconds. Aviation may have barely gotten airborne, but it quickly captured the imagination of a generation.
Flying in those days was a thrilling adventure which attracted the young in droves. Practically every boy in America would want to be an aviator.
One of those boys was a well-off young Manhattanite named Juan Trippe. Born in 1899, Trippe seemed destined to follow in his father's footsteps as a Wall Street financier. But Trippe had other ideas.
When Juan Trippe was a little boy, there was some kind of a airplane contest down at the Battery, and his father took him to it. And they were flying around the Statue of Liberty. And he could see the pilots in there and their hands and feet manipulating the pedals and things. Well, that day he fell in love with airplanes.
Like many other young men of his background, Trippe went to Yale. Yet, unlike his classmates, Trippe didn't study finance. Instead, he studied engineering, anxious for the chance to pursue flying as a career. He didn't have to wait long. When Trippe arrived in 1917, Yale was on fire with patriotic fever. The world was at war, and the sons of America's ruling families were anxious to do their part. Trippe enlisted in the Naval Air Service. The war ended before he saw action, but Trippe didn't turn his back on flying. In 1918, the U.S. government started the first fledgling attempt at scheduled air routes, the U.S. Post Office's airmail service.
How different from the first time the Army flew the mail. 1918 President and Mrs. Wilson are out for an auspicious event. The first airmail letter from the President to the New York Postmaster, and it inaugurates a new era in postal service. These historic pictures were taken by the Army Signal Corps and are among the prized possessions in War Department archives. The pilot of the first flight was Lieutenant George L. Boyle. With the president's Godspeed, the first U.S. airmail flyer takes off for New York in an old wartime Jenny and goes 25 miles without stopping.
Answering the post office's call, hundreds of young adventurers, many of them veteran fighter pilots, flocked to join the airmail. Like the Pony Express before them, these daring airmen faced incredible challenges.
They were required to fly in most unbelievable weather. We're talking instrument conditions that even pilots today would find difficult to manage.
They would take a road map and lay out the course. If the mark happened to coincide with a railroad or a highway crossing or something like that, they could tell just where they were.
Flying for the airmail was an adventure, but for many, it was a deadly one.
They lost 90 pilots in the 9 years that they were in operation. It was a very dangerous occupation.
Scores of young pilots gave their lives flying the mail, but they had paved the way for commercial aviation. In 1925, the post office opened airmail contracts to private firms. Juan Tripp leaped at the chance. He was competing against dozens of young entrepreneurs looking to transform their love of airplanes into a viable business. But Tripp had one crucial advantage: Yale.
He had connections that he'd made through his Yale career with people with tremendous wealth. And he used those connections. Sonny Whitney was a classmate of his. When the opportunity for investment came along, it was an easy connection to go to Sonny Whitney, go to George Hamilton, go to Rockefeller, and lay out his business plan. The idea of participating in something that was a new venture was interesting to them.
With $250,000 from his Yale classmates, Tripp formed Colonial Air Transport and won contracts for several routes. But domestic routes were risky. The competition from railroads was fierce and difficult to overcome.
Aviation was still a barnstorming type of career, therefore no career. He was trying to make it a business, constantly trying to push the envelope to make an airplane profitable.
It didn't work. Colonial failed to turn a profit, and Tripp, at age 27, found himself unemployed. But Tripp's first airline wasn't a total failure. He had learned the business the hard way.
He knew airplanes, he knew how to fly, he understood engineering.
Most of all, he knew in his heart that aviation had the potential to change the world. He just needed another chance to prove it. That chance came on a foggy spring morning in 1927, when Tripp drove out to Long Island to watch as Charles Lindbergh, a former airmail pilot, climbed into the cockpit of the Spirit of St. Louis and roared down the soggy runway. His mission? To cross the Atlantic non-stop. It had never been done before.
And with a lot of nerve, a 25-year-old man set out across that ocean was very equivalent to the first astronaut that ever went in outer space.
As Lindbergh winged his way towards Europe, the future of aviation and of Juan Tripp hung in the balance. The world's mightiest airline takes off.